Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. Joining me today is Michael Konczal. He is the Senior Director of Policy and Research at the Economic Security Project. He also, from 2024 to 2025, was the Chief Economist and Special Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and National Economic Council. So, because of the level and tenor of our political discourse, I have to begin with this disclaimer. If you are on the right, you will disagree with many of the things that you are about to hear. I trust that my listeners come here not because they're going to get exactly what they agree with all the time, but because they are going to get different perspectives and that they are going to use those perspectives to formulate their own view. So you should know going in that Michael Konczal, he served with President Joe Biden, gave him economic advice, and he's going to come from that viewpoint. And I would ask you, if that sends a shiver down your spine, that's all the more reason to listen to this episode. You have to listen to people that you disagree with if you're going to get ground truth about what's going on. So thank you so much to Mike for making the time and sharing his views. I learned a lot. I hope that listeners learn a lot too. Otherwise, I think that's all that I have. Take good care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. Most listeners will not be able to see the picture of FDR behind your head, but that pretty clearly telegraphs to me who your heroes are. Mike, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me on.
I was prepping for the podcast. I wanted to talk to you about the economy, the one big beautiful bill, market reaction, tariffs. We're recording on Tuesday, July 8th. We'll probably get this out in the next couple of days. Who knows how many new tariffs or new letters we will have from President Trump by the time our listeners hear this. But when I was doing my research on you, I found your Substack, and it's called Rorty Bomb. And I assume that's an allusion to Richard Rorty. Am I making a mistake there?
No, you're not. It's a very old economics blog. I started in the aughts, actually, especially around the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And it just picked up steam, and I kept writing. And now I professionally talk about the economy for a living, which is pretty amazing.
It is amazing. I sort of feel the same way about geopolitics, but you took me back to my college days because my college roommate was obsessed with Richard Rorty. He made me read Achieving Our Country just so that we could have arguments over in the chapter house at Cornell University. The chapter house has since burned down, which is really, really sad. And I came at it I was a Leo Strauss fan in college. I like to think I've grown up a little bit, still like some aspects of Strauss, but I'm not did not drink all of the Straussian Kool-Aid. But you can imagine me and my college roommate, him with Rorty on the one side, me with Strauss on the other side, dueling in a bar in Ithaca, New York. So you actually sent me down a little rabbit hole because I spent 30 minutes this morning reading Achieving Our Country and some other things. And it was both a breath of fresh air and also eerily prescient. I didn't quite realize just how much Rorty got right, both in terms of sort of the cultural left devouring the left in general, and also about his warnings about, society turning towards strongmen if government can't respond to the ills of globalization and things like that. So before we started, I just wanted to say thank you for getting Richard Rorty in my mind and ask if there was anything you wanted to share about that or why you picked Rorty as the namesake for your Substack.
It was literally like an old AIM handle. I'm of a certain age. So I was a big fan. I also was a big fan in college and read a ton too. And what I'd say for your listeners is, for a person who's dealing with really complicated theories of truth and ideas and knowledge, in addition to politics, he's a very clear writer. Even his academic work is incredibly clear and accessible in a way that I think is both good for a reader, especially if you don't have a lot of background, and also I think speaks to his philosophical commitments, which was about accessibility and egalitarianism and a lot of the really good stuff. And so, and the stuff still holds up very well. Occasionally you'll see quotes from Achieving Our Country and a few other of the later works on these political questions about right-wing populism, and they show up on social media or on Twitter X, and they get shared because they really do speak to this moment.
Well, and also fundamentally optimistic. Fundamentally had an optimism about the United States and talked about it and talked about how, the left in particular, but not just the left, was losing that optimism. That's why it was such a breath of fresh air to read him again this morning, because it was oh yes, there is this thing called national pride, and there are myths that we tell each other. And just because every single norm seems to be busted in front of our faces every single day on social media, there is an idea here. But before we get too far down the philosophical rabbit hole, why don't we start with the one big beautiful bill, or I think its official name now is something boring. The 2025 Tax Act, I think, is what they're officially calling it now. There's so much in it, and obviously the people who voted for it don't even know what's in it. Marjorie Taylor Greene uh, from my old home state of Georgia was, saying, "Oh, I didn't know that these things were in here that I voted for." It was like, "Isn't it your job to read the bill?" But when you talk about things like, the biggest Medicaid cuts in history and double what any other previous administration ever cut from Medicaid, when you talk about, cutting SNAP benefits, so getting food to poor people by something like, 25% or something radical. There was an incredible chart. I think this was Ian Bremmer, but suddenly somebody posted ICE's new budget versus the world's top defense budget. ICE will now have a budget larger than the military of Italy, the military of Israel. I mean, just kind of like mind-boggling statistics. So I just wanted to sort of there's so much we could talk about in the One Big Beautiful Bill, but if you only have 50 minutes and you're listening to this podcast, like, what are the key takeaways? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? Is there anything positive about it? What would Richard Rorty say about it? Take that question in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, before we get into the deep stuff, I think, love it or hate it, I think you can agree that the name is pretty cringe and very, very uncomfortable. And it's almost an extra level of indignity that we have to talk about the bill as such. And, it was rushed through pretty quickly, especially at the end. So again, love it or hate it. The fact that it makes such comprehensive changes from everything from our energy markets to our healthcare markets on such a quick time frame, especially at the end where they were just aiming to get it done by the 4th of July, means that I think we still don't really know, and I think the Republicans don't know, and maybe many of them don't want to know the really severe consequences it's going to have on people who aren't even directly impacted but will be indirectly impacted. So, I'd say the bill does 4 major things. It's a significant extension and rewriting of the tax code. So it extends many of the tax cuts that were passed on a temporary basis in 2017. In particular, it does about 80% of those tax cuts go to the top 10% of incomes. It's essentially $1 trillion for people who make millions and billions of dollars. And it's a cut we'll talk about the distributional in a minute, but it's a cut of a lot of programs, so that the net effect is actually that about 40% of Americans, people making $56,000 or less, $50,000 or less, will actually be worse off from this bill. They'll have less resources, either through Medicaid, SNAP, other provisions, which is very unique. The Bush tax cuts, the very first Donald Trump tax cuts in the 21st century, but under Republican governance, tend to cut taxes for everyone and just a lot more for very rich people. And you can argue what the proportional basis for that. But this is an actual reduction in the standard of living for almost half of Americans, which is just wild, given that it also blows out the deficit about $4 trillion. So, the major things that happen, I'd say there's 4. One is the taxes. The second is a reworking of our healthcare markets, cutting about 17 million people from healthcare. Third is reworking our energy markets, taking us off a path towards green energy. And then fourth is, as you brought up, a real expansion in deportations and border patrols, and particularly the funding of ICE. So, we just talked about taxes. Let's talk about healthcare for a minute. Between severe work requirements and other kinds of cuts on Medicaid, and between not extending Biden-era premium tax credits for the Obamacare exchanges, nonpartisan estimates have between 11 to 17 million people losing their health care. And if you take the totality of all those things I just mentioned, including the not extensions, it's probably closer to 17 million. In addition, that's mostly through Medicaid. Medicaid, if your listeners are thinking Medicaid, that's really like a safety net program for the very poor. Well, no, it's actually been expanded quite a bit over the last 50 years, particularly since the mid-'80s, but especially under the Affordable Care Act, what is often called Obamacare, the 2011 healthcare extension. A lot more people get healthcare through Medicaid that are middle class and working class and people who are fully employed. And about half of births happen through Medicaid. It's a much broader, more expansive program than it was 15 or 20 years ago. And this really does put a real hammer on it. We can talk a little bit about why it happens this way, but these work requirements are really kind of like paperwork requirements, and they're done when they have been done in the past, they've been done in a punitive way to try to kick people off who can't keep up with it. And if you're struggling working 2 service sector jobs, trying to raise kids on minimum wage, you don't have a lot of bandwidth. You don't have a personal attorney or accountant to go through this paperwork for you. And so, you could lose healthcare. And that's what we've seen in the states that have tried to do it, which they've often tried to walk back. And, Medicaid doesn't just help those individual people, it also backstops a lot of healthcare networks. So hundreds of rural hospitals are going to close because Medicaid is a major funder in rural communities. Hundreds of nursing homes are going to close because Medicaid supports people who are elderly on Medicare to get people who are poor to get access to nursing homes and other kinds of helpful care. So, it's going to be a really substantial reworking of the healthcare market to make healthcare a lot more precarious, a lot less a sense of a right or something that something that you work with the government to make sure you can get depending on your work status and your income status, instead of something that is much more, I don't say paranoid, but it's something that's you're much more likely to lose, something that's much more, the government's much more skeptical that you deserve to have this. And it percolates through a lot of other ways, in the ways that, how easy it is to get Obamacare exchanges, how easy it is to get certain kinds of Medicaid funding. But the general atmosphere of it is the idea that the government should be much more skeptical that you should get health care. And after, for people who remember health care before the Affordable Care Act, where you could lose health care for pre-existing conditions, it's a very different world. It's going to reverse a lot of the progress we've made against that kind of barbarism over the last 20 years.
Hmm. And
50 years.
what about green energy and immigrants? What are the cliff notes there?
Sure. So it repeals quite a bit of the green tax credits that were put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act, the 2022 law that President Biden signed into office. And, energy costs are going to go up for people. Like, reasonable estimates say maybe even next year, $110 per person, very soon, $200 a person or household annually. Crucially, at a point where there's going to be a lot of new energy demand from the mainstreaming and extension of AI, which is very data intensive with its data centers. At a point where we had started to make real progress in both the deployment of green energy, like solar panels and batteries and so forth, and also like rebuilding our competitive industrial edge in those sectors. Which was really important, both for fighting climate change, for making sure the United States is at the frontier of leading 21st century industries, and for making sure that it's not just China, who is a geopolitical frenemy, someone we don't want to be solely dependent on one country. I think that's true of any country, but in particular, we want to make sure that there's a diversified set of resources that people who, as we continue to try to decarbonize over the next decade, that's not just China. And this, I think, really throws us off that and makes it so that China will really be leading that industry in the 21st century.
Yeah. And then there's also the immigration component of this. And I have to confess, I'm so confused by the voices of some in the Republican Party. Like, Vice President Vance was somebody who in his past would have been against something like this and knows very well how important Medicaid and some of these things are to rural communities. But when he was on Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to call it, he talked about how the most important thing were the provisions on ICE and ending illegal immigration, because if we don't end illegal immigration, according to him, that's what's going to send the country into bankruptcy. And I have trouble processing that because it's actually the exact opposite. We're a country of immigrants. And we've already seen demographic rates in the United States edge down to literally historical lows. Like, they haven't gotten this low in recorded U.S. history, really, since we've been collecting the data. This is not to say that we should just open the border. Like, Biden, I think, was dealing with a really difficult border situation. And if you look at the statistics now at the border, if you could trust them, like, we're at, extreme lows of border crossings in general. But that means that immigrants are not coming into the country. And that should mean increases in the cost of labor and other things. And you're starting to hear from farmers and restaurants, others who rely on that kind of immigrant labor, that things are starting to get a little bit tight. So, I mean, there's a two-part question there. There's one, like, what do you see in the bill tied to migration? And then two, how do you explain this fixation from even people in the Republican Party who would not be cool with any of the things that you just talked about, but say, oh, no, but we need this immigration plank because this is the thing that's the real threat. Like, I'm having a really hard time explaining that move to myself.
Yeah, it is very hard to follow. I think a few things to note. One is that this funding is not just for border security. And as far as we know, a lot of the border security, build the wall kind of funding is fungible towards building large scale detention centers and concentration camps in the literal sense of like concentrating people. There's what I'd say is that. I'm going to pause for a second and ask you to take out that pause, so I can think for 1 second.
I got you.
I'd say three things. One is that we have 6 months of what, immigration policy looks like under President Trump. It is very unpopular already, given that it was a very strong issue for him going into his second term and a very bad issue for the Democrats coming out of the Biden administration. And he's already polarized it in such a way that is pretty noteworthy, and for good reason, because I don't think he's doing the things people thought he was going to do. They're not particularly going after violent criminals. They're not particularly going after gangs or cartels or people who have committed serious crimes. They're literally putting quotas on ICE to round up people. They're going to nannies in parks. They're going to people outside Home Depot. They're going to people who are having their naturalization ceremonies or processes or are part of the asylum process. And they're rounding up people, and they're not just deporting them. They're often sending them to very dangerous jails in other countries and prisons in other countries, and really punitive actions far beyond, I think, what anyone would have rationally expected. There's a really important case for border security, is a very important case for making sure people who are violent criminals are not here. That is not what they're doing. It's not what they're prioritizing. Second, with the ICE resources they've already had, they've used it to kind of do political battles that I think are unbecoming to serious concerns about, immigration and national security. They're terrorizing communities in Los Angeles because Gavin Newsom, the governor there, is an opponent of the president. They are not going after red states in the same way. They're using it as a political cudgel, and it's pretty scary that they're going to get more resources to do that kind of thing. They do not generally have the level of deportation infrastructure that they want, and so a lot of this funding is going to go to that, which is to say, building detention camps. We're already seeing one in Florida, so-called Alligator Alcatraz. That's really scary stuff. I think people are not going to like what that looks like and how it affects their communities, where, people might be opposed to immigration in abstract, but their actual neighbor who's been here 20 years and, seeking to be naturalized, who runs a business, that's, when that person's just grabbed off the street by someone in a mask who doesn't identify themselves, that's pretty scary. And then the third thing is, I often don't exaggerate or get, I always try to take a balanced view of where President Trump has been, both in his first term and second term. But the idea of building a police force that's accountable to him, that can act with the way they've already set up ICE to act, is pretty scary. The sociologist and political scientist Theda Skocpol had a really great piece in TPM, a website that talks a lot about politics, about how, one reason historically I think fascism hasn't risen or taken hold here is because there's no national police. The police are controlled by counties and cities and states in different ways. And that there is the FBI, and obviously there's the CIA, and there's other things as well. But giving the president this kind of national police force that they are using in a punitive and political way on a far expanded scale. I mean, ICE is going to have the budget of the FBI plus, is just crazy, and I think quite dangerous. So, though it's not the most immediate thing of millions of people losing their health care, and almost half of people being worse off for this bill passing, this political change I think is pretty scary, and I think it's pretty important to watch.
Yeah, and again, an area where Rorty was pretty prescient. Okay, well, before we get into some more criticism of it, I do want to try and be balanced. And of course, I don't think anybody has read this bill from start to finish. I haven't even finished reading the AI summary, 50-page AI summary that ChatGPT generated for me from the 1,000 plus pages of this bill in general. From what you've seen thus far, though, is there anything in there that you like? I mean, I know you've got FDR behind your head, and we're talking about Rorty, and anybody can look up your bio, but are there any redeeming qualities for you? Is there anything in this bill where you're like, okay, cool, that's actually a good idea, we shouldn't throw this baby out with the bathwater?
So I think if Vice President Harris had won the election in 2024, she had campaigned, as President Biden had campaigned in that election before he withdrew, on keeping the tax cuts for people making under $400,000 a year. So they made a real distinction between people who, vast majority of people, maybe 90% of the population, and then the top 10% would have their taxes raised. I think there's an argument that we should all be paying a little bit more in taxes to get a little bit more social insurance. And, the overall bill in 2017 was not particularly good. So it's not like, like going back to the tax code of 2017 wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Though I think under the political constraints we face right now, it would have certainly been the case that whoever had won the election would have continued the tax cuts for most people, which is in there. Now, of those people, now they're facing SNAP cuts, they're facing food stamp cuts, they're facing Medicaid not being there if they need it or if they use it. They're going to have indirect hits from the way their access to healthcare happens through all these other effects. I think that's all quite bad, but I think that extension probably would have happened no matter what. It's the the regressive part of it, both on the cuts and on the top 10%, top 1%. I think is particularly bad. That's honestly, I pause for a second. Let me just see if I can find something else. The child tax cut. Sorry. Cut that. Okay, start again.
I got you. Yep.
The child tax credit is extended. It's expanded out a couple $100, which is good for parents who are able to claim it. However, it's not fully refundable. So for parents with low income or no income, often young parents have a lot of kids and they're quite deep in poverty. That's not going to help them very much. Worse, and something I think is pretty cruel, is that for children who are U.S. citizens, who are born here, but have two immigrant parents without Social Security numbers, or perhaps undocumented, that child no longer qualifies for the CTC. They do if they have one parent who has a Social Security number, which was something that changed over the course of the bill, which is for the better. But the fact that it takes away a tax credit meant to help children thrive and get out of poverty and build a strong family and a foundation for success, kids who are U.S. citizens and whose parents are perhaps undocumented or immigrants. I find that very cruel, and I think it more than sours the expansion of the child tax credit, as noble as that might be.
Yeah, there's a 3-year pilot program in the bill that offers basically $1,000 from the government for any American child born between 2025 and 2028. You get $1,000 that the government's going to put up to be invested in an index fund. Well, first of all, as somebody who had daughters in 2022 and 2024, can we please make this retroactive? I don't understand why you have to be past 2025. This is a great idea. We should probably be doing this a long time ago and putting aside nest eggs for children. So just for the listeners to think, there are some things in this bill that are not terrible, but anytime you're talking about an 1,000-page bill that does all the things that you're talking about, doing it so quickly without the requisite level of discussion, we probably don't even know the things that are broken in the bill and the things that are going to be there. I want to go through your list of 4 things for a second, because from the point of view of the tax code, okay, so wealthy people are going to get taxed less and poor people are going to be taxed more. So taking money away from poor people. Number 2, getting rid of rural hospitals and some of these other things with the cuts to Medicaid, taking away people's health insurance. I'm vividly reminded, by the way, of when people, when Trump campaigned the first time, they would go out and interview people and people would say, yes, we want to get rid of Obamacare. And these people would be on Obamacare. They didn't understand that their health insurance was tied to Obamacare. I think this speaks to the charisma and power that Donald Trump has over the national psyche. We'll get there in a second. But okay, so more people will die because of this. Green energy. You're going to make energy more expensive. Look at how much solar China's turning on every single month right now. And it's not just like you don't have to be only for renewables or only for hydrocarbons. I would think that the median voter would say, what I want is cheaper energy. I don't really give a crap where it comes from. And so if you're saying no solar, no wind, we're getting rid of all of these different provisions, you're basically saying, okay, now you're chained to the hydrocarbon market, and it's been relatively low recently. That's been a reprieve on inflation, but that's not going to continue forever. And you're basically betting on one horse. And then expansion of deportation, migration, and especially illegal migration. I know that it's something that captures people's minds, but if you get rid of all immigrants, you will see growth in this country. Probably you'll see a negative impact on growth. So we're going to have lower growth, more expensive energy, people are going to die, and poor people are going to have to pay more in taxes. So the question I have is, how is this possible? Like, I understand that Donald Trump can say that he's going to shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and nobody's going to get him. He's the Teflon man. But for the Republican Party and for the congressmen and senators who need to like show things to their constituents, I don't understand how they could think that this bill is in their best interest. Because if all these things are true, they're going to get slaughtered in the midterms, aren't they? Or am I missing something?
So here's a couple things on that front. So first is that the Medicaid cuts don't go into effect until after the midterm. So at the end of next year, which is, and some of the, some of the more mega senators, Senator Tom Cotton, for instance, has emphasized, how much the coalition that they're trying to build around President Trump on the Republican side really is, includes a lot of people on Medicaid, especially this expanded Medicaid, and that, going after it's going to hurt their ability to kind of like realign the population. And he's right. And so I think maybe he thinks that you can kick it, at the end of next year, maybe, if the Democrats take the House, maybe they can work with Democrats to kick it out another 2 years. But they, the tax cuts happen right now, but some of the cuts, happen in a few years. Maybe they can be kicked out indefinitely. I don't think that's going to work because hospitals don't budget and do their capital allocation that way. And they're certainly not going to think, well, there's a 50% chance this won't happen next year. So we're going to expand right now. We're already seeing some hospitals get cut and we're going to continue to see more. So I don't think that's going to buy them the reprieve that they think it will. Second is I think they've, it's interesting that, they used to talk a lot about repealing Obamacare. That's what President Trump ran on in 2016. That was what they spent the subsequent 2 years through 2018 trying to do. And now they are in fact cutting a lot of Obamacare, killing a lot of the expansion of state level Medicaid, but they're not saying it out loud. They're actually hiding from it as much as humanly possible, which tells you that they know that the politics are bad. Senator Tillis is said he's not going to seek re-election. He's a moderate, I believe, from North Carolina, who just voted on this bill and basically checked out and said, "I'm not going to run for re-election." They give you a sense of the politics of it. And when you do ask them, and I think it sounds very poll tested, so I'm no doubt it's going to work a little bit, at least with their voters, on this idea that the only people who are going to lose their health care are able-bodied young people who could be working but aren't. And from that point of view, there's just not that many people on Medicaid like that, first of all. It's a very small percentage of the people, and you can't get that level of cuts and the savings, particularly that they have booked, without going into people who are actually working. People might lose their jobs because they have erratic hours. You're supposed to work 80 hours a month, but some people, we see it from surveys of income that, a lot of service sector workers just have very volatile hours, and maybe the hours just aren't there in a certain month, and they could lose their health care just because of the random coming and goings of their employer. And so, the idea that only undeserving people are going to get hurt by this, something that they can tell cameras a lot, but I don't think it's ultimately going to hold up for them.
Yeah, it seems to me just the economic shockwaves from this over a period of years are going to be very bad for the Republican Party. And I don't think they'll stick to President Trump. He has shown a unique ability to have water just, float off him like a duck. But the rest of the Republicans, this is major change. There's a reason, they didn't end up repealing Obamacare because, McCain famously went in there in the Senate and put the thumbs down. But careful what you wish for, sort of thing. I want to tie it to markets a little bit. Markets are relatively muted today, have been muted for the past week. Cousin Marco has been on my podcast quite a few times, and one of his talking points has been, look, when the Trump administration first came in to start the second term, they were talking about blowing out the deficit 10 to 15 trillion. Now we're talking about 3. So what? The market is this is not as bad as it could have been, and sort of proceeding forward. And he has even made the case that this is probably the last time that the U.S. government will be able to do this because, eventually the bill is going to come due. And when you've got debt climbing to wherever it is, and you've got Elon Musk over here talking about a third party based on fiscal discipline, maybe the cards are there. I can't really see that. I've sort of talked about, if you look at the spending, there's actually going to be more spending up until President Trump is theoretically no longer in office. And then the next president is supposed to inherit this and make the cuts that balance all these figures that are saying those things. But anyway, I wanted to ask you from a deficit perspective or a U.S. debt perspective, is there anything sanguine in here? Is it, do you buy this view that it's less than what it could have been? Is this the last time we're going to get this level of fiscal profligacy? Or is this just U.S. politics right now? Is it just, we don't have any fiscal conservatives? We just have people who are going to blow out the deficit to realize their political goals?
Yeah, so I want to take two different things. One is what was the kind of delta from what people might have reasonably expected in like January of this year, once it was clear, that the Republicans would have United Control, or even November, December of last year. And the deficit path is probably a bit worse than I think people would have reasonably thought. I think you would have reasonably thought that they would have extended what they had in the TCJA, the previous President Trump's 2017 bill. Some of it was permanent, but a lot of it would have expired at the end of this year. And so I think a reasonable person would have thought, well, they're going to extend that. And maybe they're going to do another $500 billion in some kind of gimmick stuff that President Trump had campaigned on, no taxes on tips, which doesn't actually end up helping as many workers as you would think, even people who make their income within tips. But instead, there's a lot more stuff on that front. A lot more stuff is made permanent. A lot more stuff like 199A, which is like, if you don't know about it, then you're not going to benefit from it. But if you do know about it, you're probably very happy. If you're a very wealthy lawyer or business owner or a person who picks their own income, like a lot of the stuff is more regressive and more permanent than I think people would have probably thought. So it definitely spends more than people, I think, reasonably would have thought. It also, I honestly didn't think they'd do the cuts to Medicaid the way they did. I think that was also surprising. And though those cuts aren't enough to offset how much more spending there is by cutting taxes, or how much more or how much less revenue there is as a result of the tax cuts, I am still very, very surprised. I would not have thought that they would have gone as hard as they did in January, for instance, when I was first thinking about what this might look like. And so, it's a bigger deficit. And some of the cuts that, you can imagine a world in which there are cuts to healthcare, but also you raise taxes because you're very worried about the deficit. That's generally how kind of like grand bargains work. But here you've just cut a bunch of healthcare in a way that's not where the healthcare costs are scary, which is, could be more like there are ways to bring down healthcare costs and healthcare spending by the government that I think have bipartisan consensus, and just, a lot of wealthy people would lose that wasteful spending. But this is not it. This is not the way to do it. You can just see it by the fact that they're saying it's not going to do anything to people, but they're budgeting as if it's going to kick 11 million people off their healthcare. So I do think it's a much worse fiscal picture than I would have thought the Trump administration was probably going to do in January. In terms of financial markets, on one hand, it's a little bit more spending, a little bit more of a net impulse, like a Keynesian fiscal stimulus into an economy that's been at the same unemployment rate for a year now, pretty much clearly near full employment. On the other hand, the tariffs are a pretty regressive drag on growth, and independent of their allocative effects, independent of how much they might slow our economy and our potential over the medium term, right out the door, it's raising taxes on consumers. And so we're already seeing revenue go up from that. And so the drag from that is probably going to balance out. So it's not clear to me there's a real big growth impulse one way or the other on this bill. People have debated on this quite a bit, but it probably nets out. So not a lot more spending. We see consumer spending basically flat this year, if not down. Stock markets have been euphoric and angry and upset and all over the place because even to this day, recording this on the 8th, I have no idea what our tariff policy is going to be, and I follow it for a living. So anyone's guess is what, a year from now, where this thing actually lands, and if it ever lands anywhere. So, I think a lot of the volatility in stock markets and financial markets probably reflects the fact that just the huge amount of uncertainty about what we're actually going to do with imports and tariffs and other really key things for the global economy.
Yeah, and maybe listeners will write to me and explain this to me. I still I just cannot comprehend the Medicaid cuts, like you said, because yes, you need to cut medical costs in the United States. It's a big portion of spending. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to do Department of Government efficiency style cutting, then you cut across the board. You try and do spending all over the place. But this is not what this bill does. This bill says, no, we're going to cut from this one thing, which means people die in places where people vote for us in large numbers. And we're going to throw money at these other things, which don't actually help, which not only yes, you can argue whether they're political or not, but they're going to increase the deficit. So the whole reason you're taking on the really tough problem of Medicaid is because the deficit is the problem, but you're not actually fixing anything. So why would you go after Medicaid? And I'm not saying this from an ideological point of view. I'm saying from a political strategy point of view. It seems really, really short-sighted to cut this thing, because if you're adding all this other stuff, why not just keep an extra trillion on so that you don't have the people that are mad at you in 2 or 3 years or whenever the cuts go through? I don't know. It's just really hard for me to process. But maybe we turn to tariffs there as well, and we can spend a little bit of time on that. It's what, July 8th. We were liberated on April 2nd or whatever it was. I hope everybody's enjoying their liberation. To your point, we don't know what tariff policy is. The Japanese don't know what tariff policy is. The South Koreans don't know what tariff policy is. Different countries and leaders of countries are getting strange letters with weird capital letters and with things spelled wrong that tells them that they are getting X tariff rate. And then President Trump is coming out and tweeting, actually, it's a deal, not a tariff, and it's all going to be towards August 1st, and it blah, 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 blah. So the flip side of that, though, is, we have not seen a huge uptick in inflation since Liberation Day. We haven't seen particularly negative jobs reports or anything like that. Like, the economy seems to be okay. So I wanted to get your take on tariffs, but also wanted to ask, why hasn't the bottom fallen out? Because it seemed for a couple weeks there after Liberation Day, we were reading about supply chain gridlock, and it was going to be COVID again without the government's support, and everything was going to fall off the wheels, and it hasn't happened. And maybe some of that is, Trump always chickens out, but it also feels like there hasn't been this sort of one-to-one relationship between the two. And maybe you'll tell me that more is coming, but I've noticed, like, I expected weirder CPI prints. I expected weirder signals in the market. And aside from, the bond market having its little freak out and the dollar continuing its descent since Liberation Day, like, most markets seem to be strangely like sanguine based on all the chaos that's happening around them. So take that any direction you want.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a reminder for your listeners, on April 2nd, President Trump announced really large tariffs that would, I believe, be essentially 20% tariff rate, which we haven't seen since the 1930s. And at that point, it was already declining. Right now, right now it's about 3%. In the first term of President Trump, it was like 1.5%. He brought it up to 2 to 3%. Now they're jumping up to 20%. Even at that, even at the point where the impact was going to be the most intense, forecasters basically gave it a 50% chance of a recession, because imports at the end of the day are not that big of part of the economy. There are things you can substitute. It's less that it would be a technical recession, where there's, 2 quarters of negative GDP growth and unemployment goes up substantially. And instead, just a more general sluggish stagnation. The analogy I use a lot is the UK, England after Brexit in 2016, where they withdrew from the European Union, really became anti-trade in the most visceral way that they could be, the equivalent of us doing 15 to 20% tariff rates, and the economy just sucked for a long time, and still sucks, right? It's slower. It's slower. Things aren't working as well. People are just feeling poorer. And once you get into that low gear, that stagnation, it's really hard to get out of it, because you first have to dig out of that thing before you can even do all the stuff we want to do. That's still hard to rebuild growth. So that's always been my base case, is less like there is going to be a recession or a like 1970 stagflation, which I thought was exaggerated, but it was at the peak number was like a reasonable fear. More this kind of like longer term stagnation. Now, a lot of companies, from what we're seeing, is, they're not sure what to do with their prices, because they're not actually sure what the end rate of these tariffs are going to be, right? So we just, we finally had another announcement yesterday on the 7th, which kind of looked a lot like the Liberation Day rates, which were quite high. And some people think, well, maybe now that the bill's passed, he's going to go ahead and go gung ho here, and Trump's administration is really going to jam through high tariffs because they did the one law that they wanted to pass. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe they think it's going to give them more negotiation to do more grandstanding and more deals. It is honestly quite hard, as someone who watches this professionally, to even really get a sense of. So you can imagine a lot of business economists at various Fortune 500 companies or the S&P 500 companies that are saying, like, we don't know what to do, so let's just kick the can. Let's wait. Let's run down inventories, which we've heard a lot about in the chatter, without necessarily increasing prices. And once you run down inventories enough, then it's all prices, right? And so that's one thing. Second, the job market, it's going to be weird, because the economy is slowing. People are spending less money. We've seen it so far this year. We're going to get another GDP report in a few weeks. It's I'll say during the Biden administration, I served in the Biden administration and worked on some of the inflation policy and analysis. The soft landing was pretty miraculous. The fact that we were able to bring down inflation from a very high level to a regular level without a recession, without unemployment really even going up very much, and with GDP growth faster than trend. Was pretty remarkable, but it did leave the economy a little fragile, right? Like interest rates have been high. Housing had slowed quite a bit. Construction had slowed quite a bit. A lot of the cyclical jobs had slowed a bit. There's a lot more jobs in healthcare. I still think that's a very solid economy, but it's not something you'd really want to stress, right? Like it's not something you really want to put pressure on. So it is true the jobs, the labor reports the last 6 months look a lot like the 6 months before at the end of the Biden administration. Unemployment between 4 and 4.2%, 150,000 jobs a month. But like once you start stressing that, there's not a lot of it could fall apart pretty quick, which is why I think the uncertainty around tariffs, much less just the tariffs themselves, has been really, really surprising to me.
Yeah. What about inflation? I know that if you look at data from Michigan Survey of Consumers, you get really high rates of expected inflation over the next 5 to 10 years. At the same time, if you look at like the New York Fed, like I think it was just this morning, like released some data that expectations were maybe down a little bit, at least from 1 year from now, 3% rather than 3.2%. I've been looking at the CPI, and I continue to think, you strip out energy, which is really bringing it down. Like, doesn't look so great to me. And I feel like, to your point, once you run down the inventories, and if you still have all of these trade issues, like you can substitute some things, but you can't substitute all things. Like we still rely on lots of inputs from lots of different places around the world. So those costs are going to have to be passed on a little bit. But where do you think we're at with inflation for the next 6 to 12 months, and maybe on a longer term time horizon as well?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we'll eventually see some more in goods. We can argue that, the price level of durable goods is generally declining. So the fact that it's increasing over the past 6 months is a notable break. I've seen some people watch this quite closely. I expect we'll see a little bit more in goods over the second half of the year and some certain kinds of services that are traded this way. I don't think you'll see huge numbers. I think what freaked out the Federal Reserve, and I think freaked out a lot of people, was what, as you said, the Michigan survey, which, inflation expectations over the next 5 to 10 years, they actually never budged during the peak inflation. If you run those numbers back, they were basically the same numbers in 2019 as they were in 2021 and 2022, when inflation was like 8% over the year. Because I think consumers didn't recognize that prices would be higher on a more enduring and durable basis. And you can argue a lot, and people argue a ton about what those numbers really mean and how accurate they are. What I'd say is that it is true that you have not seen those numbers in the financial markets data. Like the New York Fed, Cleveland Fed, and a couple other Feds like track expectations through financial data. The problem is once it's in the financial data, it's very hard to get it out. So like you would, if you waited until you were at that level, then you almost certainly need a recession to bring down inflation. I think that some of the Michigan numbers have rolled back, as I think people have understood that the worst version of tariffs have rolled back, though who knows what just happened yesterday as we're recording this. So what I'd say is that, I think the worst case scenarios have eased up quite a bit since April, that Trump is probably going to have something still quite high and already generating quite a bit of revenue. So it's, quite an important tax increase on working day Americans, but is going to be a little less of the scary stagflation. And I think, the Fed's going to start probably adjusting to that reality as well. It is funny to watch the Trump administration say like everyone got it wrong because like they didn't do the thing that they said that they were going to do. Because you see a lot of like, oh my God, there's no inflation. It's like, yes, because you're not doing the thing you threatened to do in April. So congratulations. So that's kind of where I think it is right now. I think that's where most analysts are on this.
Yeah. I don't envy Jerome Powell at all, but rate cuts through the end of the year, what are your views? Do you think we're going to get some, or do you think that Jerome's going to hold the line? It sounds like we're not thinking about increases, although if you did have an inflation surprise to the upside, I don't quite know what Trump or Powell would do with themselves. But how are you thinking about interest rates through the rest of the year?
So if you So the Fed itself reports this, but if you were just to plug the economy as a whole into what economists call a Taylor rule, but basically is just like a little widget in Excel that kind of gives you what the rate the Fed should be doing is, it's basically where it is right now. It's approximately within the range we have right now. So
Hmm.
um, the Fed's not very much off. And crucially, and I think this is really important for the way these debates are playing out, is that, you could argue maybe the Fed should cut a quarter of a percentage point for your listeners. The Fed cuts in quarter percentages. So it's like 4 or 4.25 or 4.5. I could see the argument for cutting a quarter of a percent from, I believe it's 4.5 to 4.25 right now, depending. Um, President Trump has said he wants rates at 1% or 2%, which would be, 2.5 percentage points cuts, right? Like 10 cuts as opposed to one. And there, I do not see a plausible case for why you should have rates at that level. And so the idea that this is like the late in the year 2021, or perhaps this right when inflation really took off, or took off in a much more durable way, or the summer of 2008 when the financial Bear Stearns had collapsed, Lehman had not yet, but a lot of people worried the Fed, which was not cutting rates very aggressively, was missing the Great Recession. I don't see that case for here right now. I do not think the Fed is so offsides, and as it has been in the past, to justify the pressure. I think the Fed should be independent, period. But the level of pressure Trump officials are putting on, I think, is completely detached from any economic analysis, and they want to really do different things with it, like have the Fed just basically manage the debt instead of inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to interpret any other rationale towards cutting interest rates that low besides debasing the currency and inflating your way out of a debt problem, which is not what you would expect from the halls of power in the Republican Party. We've got
But for a
10
casino
more.
owner
Oh,
who
yeah,
is
please go ahead.
a real estate mongol who has done bankruptcy many times, maybe it does actually fit his view of how the economy should work. But hopefully,
Well, and
cooler
maybe the
heads
United
prevail.
States is in a position where somebody who has great experience with bankruptcy is somebody that should be in control, because that's a different way of thinking about things. I'm going to give you an impossible brief to close out, which is inspired by Rorty, because we began talking about Rorty, and I wanted to bring it back to him because I think when he talked about the left, and he talked about how the cultural left basically swallowed everything else, so that things became more about identity politics or political correctness rather than working with workers and figuring out how to help people in the context of globalization, which exacerbated inequality. Let's say it's 4 years from now. I wave the magic wand. A man or woman, whoever you want, is president and hires you to be the chief economist or the chief economic advisor for them, and you're inheriting what you see so far. Like we said, it could change 500 billion different times before then, based on how the administration is going. But in a couple of years, if you had a change in power and you had the ear of whoever was going to be in the office next, what would you advise? How would you start to pick up the pieces, or what kind of, like, not just hey, the one beautiful bill sucks, like what would you substitute for some of the things that we're seeing that are passing as policy in the United States?
Well, I can say I'll bring up stuff that I know will still be an issue in a few years because I can't tell what will be new issues, and how we'll
For sure.
sufficiently address things like the civil service and how well the government works post Doge, and a lot of government cuts and a lot of other things that are going to probably be happening with the Supreme Court. I do know affordability will still be an issue on the key things that really matter for people: housing, healthcare, childcare, retirement security, food and energy. I work at the Economic Security Project. I'm the senior director of research and policy, and at ESP, we work on policy that helps build power for working people. And one thing we're really focused and thinking a lot about is affordability. A lot of our work has been on income support, and a lot of our work has been on market crafting, which is to say that there are certain things where people need a level of resources. Say if you're a child in poverty or you're someone who's retired, where you need a level of income support. Or a level of baseline access to a resource. And then there are markets that deliver them that can be quite dysfunctional, which prevent people from getting the resources that they need. Like we're
Mhm.
concerned about getting money into people's pockets, and we're also concerned about people who are trying to take it out of their pockets. So with that in mind, we think a lot about affordability, and we think a lot about how the way certain kinds of baseline supports, but also certain kinds of market structuring can make things much more accessible. So when you think about food security, we think about like, well, what about guaranteed income? What about expanded EITC or CTC or other forms of income support? And also consolidation in groceries and meatpacking, and as well as public groceries. Maybe that has a role to do. That can play a role. Like, how do you structure food markets so that they're competitive and getting things where they need to go? But also, how do you make sure that there's just enough money so people can afford food, no matter how competitive the market is? And I think, those two tools under a framework of affordability, I think are still going to be quite urgent. Thinking about Rorty, thinking about other people who have thought about capitalism for a long time, those are still the fundamental problems. Even, people think correctly about, the risks that AI could pose, both like kind of existentially, but also just like, the labor market and people's careers. And, we dealt with this going from agriculture to industrial economy. And I don't know if the AI will be as big as that was, which was quite dramatic and helped pioneer the role of social insurance and antitrust. And, I think those two tools, structuring markets so that they work better, and then making sure people have the resources to get things in markets through work and through non-work means of income, of gaining access to income, those will still be very relevant in a few years. And that's not necessarily a specific platform someone should run on. But knowing that the affordability crisis and those things is not going away, and the conceptual tools we can use to tackle them are still going to be the same. I think that's a pretty good foundation to start to do a lot of thinking on, as we're doing right now at Economic Security Project.
The things that motivated people to vote for President Trump will still be there at the end of his administration. Those things won't be fixed. If anything, they'll be even more acute. So you'll probably still, those will probably still be hot button political topics. How do you pay for those things, especially when you think we're adding another $3 trillion or whatever to the deficit with this new bill? Like, at what point does the debt just become a handicap on our ability to do anything like some of the things that you're talking about? Because that takes spending. And the left in general is talking about using the government to spend in order to take care of people. But it's hard to do that when you're starting to close in on 40 trillion or whatever it is. So how would you try to approach that Gordian knot?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things there. One is that, interest on the debt will start to pile up, and that'll start to eat more into the budget. And whether or not that's an actual economic constraint, it certainly is a political constraint. It's what forced George Herbert Walker Bush's hand in the late 80s and early 90s to do a deficit deal with Democrats when interest on the debt had gotten to levels that it will soon get to now, following President Reagan's tax cuts. So one could imagine something like that happening in the next few years, or, over the next 5 to 10 years. Depends a lot on how much feedback there is in the financial markets. I mean, rates are quite high. They might come down a little bit, but they probably won't come down a lot, and they're probably not going to come down to 2019 levels. So, the ability of the economy to grow faster than the interest on debt grows is probably going to be a little bit more subdued. Something that gave us a lot of wiggle room in the past, maybe less so, especially if we're going to have a lower growth because we are now tariffed and trumped. The economy is just between nativism and tariffs has just moved into a much slower growth path. That said, when it comes to affordability, a lot of it is about containing costs, and a lot of it is about moving costs more efficiently to the government, right? So moving some private healthcare into a public option for Medicare, which I think people would like more, can in fact save money. And though it's moving from private to public, which is a big deal, it does mean that there's more resources overall. In the same way the Affordable Care Act was able to slow and bend the cost curve of healthcare. So I think there are efficiency gains that you could make that are credible, and I think that could help do things. I think there's also a lot of growth you could unleash through investments, through housing policy that could help bolster the case. But you are right that it's a little tough to figure out right now, in part because we haven't seen the full impact on interest rates yet and what they'll look like in a year or two. But it is something that will become more of an issue sooner than later.
Well, Mike, I hope you'll consent to come back in a year or two to talk about it with us when we see kind of what unfolds. And otherwise, just thank you for making the time and sharing your perspective. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.